The investigation into the death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells was already surrounded by unanswered questions. Then, as the family continued demanding answers, a series of new developments began pulling the case in several different directions. There were reports of threats. People connected to the case began seeking legal protection. Nolan's family brought in outside counsel and pursued an independent investigation. Then came a professional misconduct complaint involving Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Winsley. For a grieving family trying to understand how their son died, each new development brought another question. What was happening around the investigation, and why was the situation becoming so heated? You're very welcome here, and I'm glad you've joined us. If you enjoy following stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next update. To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Nolan Wells was an 18-year-old college football player who went missing after a July 4th boating trip near a barrier island off Horn Island in Mississippi. According to the reporting cited in the source material, Nolan reportedly did not return to the boat with his friends. 2 days later, his body was found washed ashore. The circumstances surrounding his death remained unclear. Nolan's family wanted a thorough investigation. They wanted answers about what happened during those missing hours, and they wanted to know how Nolan died. The family hired attorney Ben Crump to help navigate the case. They also ordered an independent autopsy, but that examination reportedly did not establish a cause or manner of death. At the same time, the official state medical examination was reportedly completed. The results, including toxicology information, had not yet been publicly released, according to the source material. Those results were expected to become part of a larger case file that could eventually be presented to a grand jury. And that meant the most important answers were still somewhere ahead. If you're new here, you're very welcome. And if you enjoy following stories like this as they develop, consider subscribing so you can stay with us as we examine the details together. But while the official investigation was moving forward, something else was happening outside the formal process. The public discussion surrounding Nolan's death was becoming increasingly intense. Reports indicated that 3 people had been criminally charged with making threats connected to the case. According to the discussion in the source material, those alleged threats involved people such as a judge whose son had reportedly been with Nolan that day, a witness, and local officials. That was a significant development. The investigation was supposed to be about determining what happened to Nolan. Now, people connected to the investigation were reportedly dealing with threats and harassment, and that raised a difficult question. Could the growing public attention actually make it harder to find the truth? The family was also facing another unexpected development. According to outlets cited in the source material, the Mississippi Board of Nursing had apparently launched a professional misconduct investigation involving Nolan's mother after an anonymous complaint. For Christine, this was not simply another headline. She was a grieving mother who was also a professional, with a career and patients who depended on her. Ben Crump reportedly described the complaint as a possible attempt to intimidate her and discourage her from continuing to ask questions about her son's death. He said, "Attacking a grieving mother's career does not answer the question of what happened to Nolan." But there was another important detail. Christine later posted that the Mississippi Board of Nursing had closed the professional misconduct case. She thanked people who had continued to support the family and explained that the episode had added more pain during an already devastating period. She also said that she loved her job and her patients. The complaint had been made, an investigation had apparently followed, and then the matter was closed. But the circumstances surrounding the complaint immediately became part of the wider debate. Was it simply an anonymous complaint that had nothing to do with Nolan's death? Or did the timing deserve closer examination? The attorney Rich Shenstein, speaking in the source material, acknowledged that the timing could appear suspicious, particularly if Christine had never previously faced a professional complaint during her career. But he also emphasized an important point. Suspicion about timing is not the same thing as proof about someone's motive. That distinction matters in an investigation like this. There were already competing narratives developing around Nolan's final hours. One issue concerned reports that Nolan had been drinking heavily with friends on the day he disappeared. According to the source material, preliminary information from a Mississippi Department of Marine Resources document was cited by ABC News in reporting that witnesses had told investigators Nolan had been drinking heavily. Christine disputed that narrative publicly. During an appearance on the Don Lemon Show, she questioned whether that account was actually established by the evidence. She also described information she said came from one of Nolan's football coaches. According to Christine, the coach told her he had seen Nolan sometime between approximately 2:45 and 3:30 that afternoon. She said the coach remembered Nolan as being perfectly fine, talking about college, his life, and his plans. Those two accounts created another point of tension. On one side was reporting about witnesses describing Nolan as heavily intoxicated. On the other was his mother's account of what a football coach reportedly observed that afternoon. And neither detail, by itself, answered the central question. What actually happened after Nolan separated from his friends? The answer was still unclear. Meanwhile, the family continued to challenge aspects of the public narrative. They questioned accounts about whether Nolan would have voluntarily remained alone on Horn Island. They also raised concerns about information from Nolan's phone, suggesting that data may have been deleted or tampered with. Those were serious claims, and they were not established as facts in the source material, but they showed just how far apart the different sides of the story had become. Then another development emerged that would bring even more lawyers, money, accusations, and public confrontation into the Nolan Wells case. Nolan's friends and their families reportedly established a legal defense fund. At the time discussed in the source material, that fund had raised more than $158,000, and the message behind the fund was clear. The young men who had been with Nolan were saying that they had become targets of online accusations, harassment, and threats. They said they had cooperated with authorities. They said they had provided information about where they were, and they wanted money to defend themselves against potential legal action and what they described as false accusations. That development changed the atmosphere around the investigation once again, because now there were two groups publicly seeking answers and protection. Nolan's family was demanding to know how their son died, and some of the people who had been with Nolan were preparing to defend themselves against accusations surrounding his death. The investigation itself was still moving forward, but around it, another battle was taking shape, and the next question was becoming impossible to ignore. Where does legitimate questioning end, and where does accusation become something that could create legal consequences? The Legal Defense Fund brought a new dimension to the Nolan Wells investigation. Until then, much of the public discussion had centered on Nolan, his family, his friends, and the unanswered questions surrounding his final hours. Now, some of the young men who had been with him were publicly saying that they needed lawyers because of what was happening outside the investigation. According to the statement associated with the fund, Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, Morgan Seymour, and others said they had faced online accusations, harassment, and threats since Nolan's death. The statement claimed that some of them had even been unable to attend Nolan's funeral because of concerns about what might happen. Those are serious allegations, and they show how quickly an investigation can become something much larger when the public begins forming its own theories before authorities have announced all of the evidence. The fund had reportedly raised more than $158,000 at the time discussed in the source material. Its stated purpose was to help defend the young men against possible wrongful death claims and to pay for legal assistance in responding to what they described as defamatory accusations. But there was an important distinction to make. Getting a lawyer does not establish that someone has done something wrong. In fact, the attorney Rich Shenstein made that point repeatedly. If someone is a potential suspect, a witness, or simply a person who has become the target of public accusations, there can be legitimate reasons to obtain legal representation. And in this case, there was another reason. The people involved were dealing with an investigation that had attracted enormous public attention while the facts were still developing. Shenstein argued that someone who is being questioned by authorities and simultaneously receiving threats or being accused publicly may reasonably want an attorney present. That does not answer whether anyone involved in Nolan's disappearance or death bears responsibility. It simply means that the legal battle and the criminal investigation are two separate things. But there was another development that suggested Nolan's family might also be preparing for a legal battle. According to the source material, Nolan's mother appeared to have sought records from several social media and technology companies. The names mentioned included TikTok, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Meta, and Life360. The requests were part of legal efforts involving Nolan's estate. There was also reporting that the family had sent preservation notices concerning evidence to families connected to some of Nolan's friends and to other people connected to the investigation. A preservation notice can be important because it asks people or organizations to preserve potentially relevant information rather than allowing it to disappear. Think about the kind of information that might exist on a phone in a case like this: messages, location information, photographs, videos, calls, social media activity. Those details could potentially help establish where people were and what they were doing at particular times. But the source material does not establish that any specific piece of information was deleted or altered. That distinction is important. The family had raised concerns about Nolan's phone, but concern is not proof. And the same principle applied to the young men who had been with Nolan. Their decision to obtain lawyers did not prove guilt. Their cooperation with authorities did not automatically prove innocence. The investigation still had to establish what happened. That is where the situation became complicated. Nolan's family had been outspoken about the information being discussed publicly. They pushed back against reports concerning Nolan's alleged drinking. They questioned whether he would have remained on Horn Island without his friends. They also raised questions about information connected to his phone. The friends and their families, meanwhile, said they were being unfairly blamed for something they had not been shown to have done. Both sides were operating in an atmosphere where every statement could be examined, repeated, criticized, or turned into another theory online. And there was a legal line running through all of it. What can a person say publicly about another person without crossing into defamation? That question became particularly important because people were not simply discussing the case privately anymore. They were posting about it online. They were giving interviews. They were making accusations. And some people connected to the case were reportedly considering lawsuits. Rich Shenstein explained that one of the important questions in a defamation dispute is whether someone is making a statement of fact or expressing an opinion. There is a significant difference between saying, "I believe this investigation is not looking closely enough at the evidence," and saying, "I know this person was responsible for the death." The first is presented as an opinion. The second is an accusation of fact. And when someone publicly accuses another person of committing a crime without evidence to support that accusation, the potential legal consequences can become much more serious. That distinction may sound simple, but in real disputes, it can become complicated. People often mix opinions, assumptions, rumors, and statements of fact together. One person says They are only asking questions. Another person hears an accusation. A social media post is shared thousands of times. A short video clip removes the surrounding context. And before long, something that began as speculation can start being repeated as though it were established fact. That appeared to be one of the major concerns surrounding the Nolan Wells case. The families on both sides were dealing with enormous emotional pressure. Nolan's family was grieving the loss of an 18-year-old son. The families of his friends were defending young men who, according to the source material, had also lost someone they considered a friend. And then there were the investigators, who still had to work through the evidence without allowing the public conversation to determine the outcome. The source material makes clear that authorities had not established that a crime had occurred. Nolan had died tragically, but at that stage, there was no established perpetrator. There were unanswered questions, reports, competing accounts, and an investigation still underway. That distinction matters because public pressure can move much faster than an official investigation. Online, people can reach conclusions in minutes. Investigators may need weeks or months to examine records, interview witnesses, review forensic evidence, and wait for medical results. That difference in speed creates tension. Nolan's family wanted answers. The public wanted answers. The people who had been with Nolan wanted to protect themselves. And investigators had to determine what the evidence actually showed. Then came another development that brought the possibility of a wrongful death lawsuit into sharper focus. The legal notices and requests for information suggested that Nolan's family might be preparing to pursue answers through the civil courts if the criminal investigation did not provide them. That does not mean a lawsuit had been filed or that anyone had been found responsible. But it raised the possibility of a second legal track running alongside the investigation. A wrongful death case can involve questions that are different from those in a criminal prosecution. An attorney might argue that someone's negligence contributed to a death even if there were no allegations that the person intentionally caused it. In Nolan's case, the source material discussed the possibility that questions could arise about why he was left alone on the island, and whether anyone had a responsibility to make sure he returned safely. Again, those were legal possibilities being discussed, not established findings. And that difference became more important as the case moved forward. Because if civil litigation were eventually pursued, people who had already spoken publicly could potentially find their earlier statements examined closely. What they said, when they said it, what they knew at the time, and whether their version of events remained consistent. That is why Shenstein suggested that, in some circumstances, it may be better to wait until criminal proceedings are completed before pursuing related civil litigation, although legal deadlines can complicate that decision. So the Nolan Wells investigation was now surrounded by several overlapping questions. What happened during those final hours? What did the people with Nolan actually see? What will the medical and toxicology results show? What information exists on the phones and social media accounts? And perhaps most importantly, can the investigation separate verified evidence from the enormous amount of speculation surrounding the case? There was still one more piece of this story that deserved attention. A man described in the source material as an apparent friend of Nolan, Bart Edmondson Jr., had reportedly retained an attorney after being accused online of somehow being connected to what happened. His attorney sent a statement to Law and Crime describing what he called false and defamatory accusations. The family also reportedly sent a cease and desist letter to an online influencer over alleged misinformation. Once again, the same pattern was appearing. The investigation had not reached its conclusion, but the legal consequences of public accusations were already beginning to emerge. And that raised a final question for the next stage of the story. If everyone involved is demanding the truth, How can the investigation move forward when so many different versions of that truth are already circulating? At this point, the Nolan Wells investigation had become much larger than the original question of what happened on that July 4th boating trip. There was Nolan's death. There was the search for answers. There were questions about the people who had been with him. There were disputes over what Nolan had been doing before he disappeared. And now there were lawyers, legal threats, online accusations, and families on both sides trying to protect themselves. But beneath all of that, one fact remained unchanged. Nolan Wells was 18 years old, and his family still did not have a clear public explanation for how he died. The independent autopsy commissioned by the family reportedly did not establish a cause or manner of death. The official state medical examination had reportedly been completed, but the results had not yet been publicly released at the time described in the source material. Those medical findings could become extremely important. Toxicology results, for example, can sometimes help investigators understand what was in a person's system before death. But until those results are released, people outside the investigation can only speculate. And that is exactly what Nolan's family had been pushing back against. One of the most disputed issues was the claim that Nolan had been drinking heavily with friends before he disappeared. The source material says preliminary information from a Mississippi Department of Marine Resources document was cited in reporting by ABC News. According to that reporting, witnesses reportedly told investigators that Nolan had been drinking heavily that day. But Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Winsley, challenged that account publicly. She questioned whether the claim was actually supported by what people who knew Nolan had seen that afternoon. She also said a football coach had told her that he spoke with Nolan between approximately 2:45 and 3:30 p.m. and remembered him discussing college, his life, and his plans. Those details matter because the timeline is central to the case. If Nolan was seen appearing perfectly fine during that period, what happened afterward? How did he end up separated from the group? And what happened between the last confirmed observations of him and the discovery of his body 2 days later? The available material does not answer those questions. That is why the investigation still matters. It is also why the growing legal conflict creates such a difficult situation. Nolan's family has the right to seek answers and to challenge information they believe is wrong. The people who were with Nolan also have the right to legal representation if they are being accused, threatened, or questioned in connection with an investigation. Neither side's decision to hire lawyers establishes what happened, and that is something worth remembering when looking at any developing case. A person hiring an attorney does not automatically mean that person is guilty. A grieving family hiring an attorney does not automatically mean that someone else is responsible. And an online accusation does not become evidence simply because thousands of people repeat it. That distinction became especially important after reports emerged about threats against people connected to the investigation. 3 people had reportedly been criminally charged with making threats connected to the case. The allegations involved people, including a judge whose son was reportedly with Nolan that day, as well as a witness and local officials. The case had begun generating consequences beyond the people directly involved. And once threats enter an investigation, the situation becomes even more serious. The purpose of an investigation is to establish facts. Threats can intimidate witnesses. Harassment can discourage people from speaking. And public accusations can make it harder for investigators to separate what someone actually knows from what they have heard online. That was also part of the reason legal professionals in the source material urged caution. Rich Shenstein said that investigators do not normally reveal every piece of evidence as they find it. They interview witnesses, examine forensic evidence, review records, and work through the case step by step. That process can feel painfully slow to a family waiting for answers. But there is a reason investigators cannot simply release every detail immediately. Some evidence may need to remain confidential. Some witnesses may still need to be interviewed. Some information may need to be compared against other evidence before investigators know whether it is reliable. And if a grand jury eventually becomes involved, the public may not receive every detail of that process either. According to the source material, the completed state medical examination was expected to become part of a larger case file that could be sent to a grand jury for consideration of possible criminal charges. But there was no confirmed timeline for that process, so the public was left waiting. Meanwhile, the civil side of the case continued to develop. The preservation notices and requests for records suggested that Nolan's family was taking steps to protect information that could potentially become relevant later, and the possibility of a wrongful death action raised another question. Could a civil case provide information that the family felt it was not receiving through the criminal investigation? An attorney could potentially pursue records, question witnesses, and examine circumstances surrounding Nolan's death. But a civil lawsuit would also bring its own complications. If someone involved in a civil case later became a witness in a criminal proceeding, statements made during the civil process could become relevant to questions about credibility. That is one reason the legal experts in the source material discussed the timing of civil litigation. There can also be statutes of limitations that prevent families from waiting indefinitely before bringing certain claims, so there may be pressure from both directions. Wait too long, and legal deadlines could become an issue. Move too quickly, and the civil case could complicate the criminal investigation. And through all of this, the public conversation continued. Nolan's friends and their families said they were being unfairly targeted. The Wells family continued to seek answers about Nolan's death. Online personalities and media outlets continued discussing the case. Attorneys became involved. And people who may have had nothing more than a connection to Nolan found themselves facing public accusations. Bart Edmondson Jr. was one example mentioned in the source material. After accusations circulated online suggesting that he was somehow connected to Nolan's death, he reportedly retained an attorney. His attorney sent a statement to Law and Crime describing what he characterized as false and defamatory accusations. The family also reportedly sent a cease and desist letter to an online influencer over alleged misinformation. Again, none of that establishes who was responsible for Nolan's death. But it does show what happens when a case becomes a public spectacle before all the facts are available. A person can be accused long before investigators have reached a conclusion. A family can be criticized for demanding answers. A witness can become the subject of online theories. And a single statement can travel far beyond the circumstances in which it was originally made. That is why the central question should remain simple. What does the evidence actually show? Not what someone posted, not what a stranger believes happened, not what a theory suggests. The evidence. At the time covered by the source material, the evidence had not produced a public final answer. There were still unanswered questions about Nolan's final hours, the circumstances surrounding his disappearance, the medical findings, and what happened between the boating trip and the discovery of his body. There were also questions about what additional information might eventually come from phones, social media accounts, witnesses, medical records, and other investigative material. And there was one thing the family and the people defending themselves appeared to have in common, even though they were on opposite sides of the public debate. They wanted their own version of events to be heard. The Wells family wanted people to understand that they were not satisfied with unanswered questions. Nolan's friends and their families wanted people to understand that accusations against them were having consequences. The legal system would ultimately have to distinguish between those competing claims and whatever the evidence could actually establish. For now, that means the most responsible conclusion is also the simplest one. Nolan Wells died tragically after disappearing during a July 4th boating trip. His family is still seeking answers. The official findings described in the source material had not publicly resolved all of the questions. And the growing threats, legal disputes, and online accusations had created a second story surrounding the first one. The investigation into Nolan's death was still the central issue, but the public battle surrounding that investigation had become impossible to ignore. So, what do you think should happen next? Should the public conversation slow down and allow investigators to complete their work, or do you believe the pressure being placed on the case is necessary to make sure every question surrounding Nolan's death receives a serious answer? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to continue following this story as more information becomes available, make sure you're subscribed.